When my stepbrother stole my credit card and pulled a $200,000 BMW into our driveway, he thought he was taking the ride of his life. But the moment he turned that ignition, he didn't realize he was actually starting his own prison sentence. Once the bank records were unsealed, neither he nor my mother could believe what was happening. Justice is sometimes served cold, but my revenge? My revenge was about to cost him everything. Before we continue, if you love seeing justice served, make sure to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, let's go back to that expensive day. I was in my office in downtown Chicago, buried deep in financial reports as usual. I'm Rebecca, a disciplined financial analyst who has built a life on numbers. I know where every single penny in my account goes. But that morning, a notification popped up on my phone that made my blood run cold. The screen clearly read, "Purchase authorized, $212,500, BMW dealership Chicago downtown." My first reaction was to laugh. I thought this has to be a system error. What bank approves a $250,000 transaction in a single swipe? I called the bank immediately, but the customer service representative's voice was shaking. She told me the transaction was made physically in the store using the chip and asked if my card was with me. My hand flew to my wallet. My heart skipped a beat. The special slot where I kept my emergency card was empty. When I drove home, the scene hit me like a punch to the gut. There, sitting in our driveway, shimmering under the sun, was a brand new metallic gray BMW M8, and leaning over the hood, polishing it with a cloth, was him. My stepbrother, Logan. 23 years old, never worked a day in his life, and obsessed with showing off. When I got out of my car, he looked at me with that smug grin. He asked if I liked it and told me to call it an investment. He said he would drive it for a few months, sell it, and double the money, claiming I should be thanking him. My ears were ringing. I screamed, asking if he stole my card. He just shrugged, as relaxed as if he'd bought a pack of gum. He told me stealing was a harsh word and that he just borrowed it, adding that Dad would handle it and I shouldn't overreact. That evening, all hell broke loose. But Logan still didn't grasp the severity of what he had done. My stepfather, Michael, and my mother, Dana, were sitting in the living room when I threw the emergency bank report onto the table. I told them the signature is forged, but the camera footage is real. 2:30 p.m. Logan walks into the dealership, uses my card, and fakes my signature. Logan tried to save himself, telling Mom it was just a prank and he would return it. But when I looked at the red stamp at the bottom of that report, I realized Logan hadn't just bought a car. He had signed a document that would ruin his life. Because there was one small detail Logan didn't know. That wasn't just a regular credit card. My stepfather Michael picked up the report, his face turning pale white. He looked at me and asked if the account linked to the card was a corporate account. I smiled and told him it was worse. I said Logan just committed a federal crime. Watch what happens next, because this was only the beginning. The room fell into a silence so thick you could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Michael's hands were trembling as he held that bank report, and my mother, Dana, looked like she'd been hit by a truck. Logan, on the other hand, still hadn't connected the dots. He was sitting there on the couch with his arms crossed, acting like this was all some big misunderstanding that would blow over by morning. But I knew better. I had spent years building my career in finance, and I knew exactly what Logan had just walked into. That credit card he stole wasn't tied to my personal checking account. It was linked to a specialized investment account that I managed for 3 high-net-worth clients, and every transaction over $50,000 triggered an automatic federal audit because of anti-money laundering regulations. Logan didn't just steal from me. He triggered a chain reaction that would bring federal investigators, the IRS, and possibly even the FBI into our lives. My mother finally broke the silence, her voice cracking as she asked me what I meant by federal crime. I explained it slowly, making sure every word sank in. I told her that the account Logan accessed was flagged by the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, and that when you make an unauthorized transaction of that size, it's not just theft anymore. It's wire fraud, identity theft, and potential money laundering. Each of those charges carried prison time. Real prison time. Not a slap on the wrist or community service. We were talking 5 to 10 years minimum if they decided to prosecute fully. Logan's face finally changed. The cocky grin melted away and was replaced by something I'd never seen in him before. Fear. Pure, raw fear. He stammered, asking if I was serious, and I could see his hands starting to shake. Michael put his head in his hands and whispered that Logan had no idea what he'd done. My mother started crying, begging me to fix this somehow, asking if there was any way to make it go away. But here's the thing, I didn't want to make it go away. Not yet. Logan had tormented me for years since our parents got married. He had borrowed my clothes without asking and ruined them. He had used my car and returned it on empty. He had eaten my food, invaded my privacy, and treated me like I was his personal bank account. And every single time, my mother had made excuses for him. She'd say he was young, that he was still figuring things out, that I should be more understanding because he didn't have a strong male role model growing up. Well, now he had a very strong set of federal prosecutors who were about to teach him about accountability. The next morning, I received a call from my bank's fraud investigation department. The agent on the phone introduced himself as Detective Marcus Chen from the Financial Crimes Unit, and he told me they had reviewed the surveillance footage from the dealership and confirmed that the person who used my card was not me. He asked if I knew who it was. I paused for just a moment, letting the weight of that question hang in the air. This was my chance. I could lie, cover for Logan, and try to clean up this mess quietly, or I could tell the truth and let justice take its course. I took a deep breath and told Detective Chen that yes, I knew exactly who it was. It was my stepbrother, Logan Hall, and I wanted to press full charges. Within 48 hours, 2 federal agents showed up at our house. They were polite but firm, and they had a warrant to seize the BMW and all of Logan's electronics. My mother was hysterical, crying and begging them to understand that it was just a mistake, that Logan didn't understand what he was doing. But the lead agent, a woman named Agent Sarah Winters, looked at my mother with the kind of expression that said she'd heard every excuse in the book. She told my mother that ignorance of the law was not a defense, and that her son had committed multiple felonies that carried mandatory minimum sentences. They took Logan away in handcuffs. I watched from the upstairs window as they put him in the back of their unmarked sedan. My mother collapsed on the front lawn, and Michael had to help her back inside. Part of me felt a twinge of guilt. He was family, even if only by marriage. But then I remembered the way he'd grinned at me in the driveway, so smug and confident that he'd get away with it. No, he needed to learn this lesson. Over the next few days, the story exploded. The local news picked it up first with a headline that read, "Chicago man arrested for luxury car fraud using family member's account." Then the financial blogs got hold of it, and suddenly I was getting calls from reporters asking for interviews. My firm's partners called me into a meeting, concerned that the scandal might affect our reputation. I assured them that I was the victim here, and that I was cooperating fully with authorities. They seemed satisfied, but I could tell they were watching me closely. The pressure was building from every direction. My mother stopped speaking to me entirely. She would walk past me in the house without making eye contact, and when I tried to talk to her, she would just shake her head and walk away. Michael tried to play mediator, telling me that he understood I was hurt, but asking if there was any way to show mercy. He said Logan was young and stupid, not malicious, and that a federal conviction would destroy his entire future. And that's when I realized something important. I had all the power here. Logan's fate was literally in my hands. If I dropped the charges and worked with the prosecutors to frame this as a family dispute rather than a crime, they might let him plead down to a misdemeanor. He'd get probation, maybe some community service, and life would go on. But if I pushed forward, if I testified against him and provided all the evidence I had, Logan would go to prison. A real prison with real consequences. The question was, what did I actually want? Did I want revenge, or did I want justice? And more importantly, were those two things the same? 3 weeks after Logan's arrest, I received a call that changed everything. It was from an unknown number, and when I answered, a man's voice said hello and asked if I was Rebecca Hall. I confirmed, and he told me his name was Jonathan Pierce and that he was an attorney representing someone who wanted to make me a very interesting offer. Watch what comes next, because this is where the story takes a turn nobody saw coming. Page 3. Jonathan Pierce had one of those voices that made you pay attention immediately, smooth and calculated like he'd rehearsed every word before saying it. He told me he represented a private client who had been following my case very closely and wanted to meet with me in person to discuss a potential resolution that would benefit everyone involved. I asked him who his client was, but he said that information would be disclosed only at the meeting, which was scheduled for the following evening at a high-end restaurant downtown. Everything about this felt strange, but my curiosity got the better of me. I agreed to meet him. The next evening, I walked into Morton's Steakhouse wearing my best business suit, trying to project confidence even though my stomach was in knots. Jonathan Pierce was waiting at a private corner booth, and sitting next to him was someone I absolutely did not expect to see. It was Victor Ashford, one of the wealthiest real estate developers in Chicago, and coincidentally one of the 3 clients whose investment account was linked to the card Logan had stolen. My heart dropped into my stomach because I realized this meeting was about to get very complicated. Victor stood up when I approached, extending his hand with a warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He told me it was good to finally meet me in person and that he'd heard excellent things about my work. I shook his hand cautiously and sat down, waiting for him to explain why he'd brought me here. Victor got straight to the point. He told me he'd been briefed on the situation with my stepbrother, and that he understood I was the victim of a serious crime. But he also said that as someone whose money was in that account, he had a vested interest in how this situation resolved. He explained that federal investigations like this one tended to freeze accounts for months during the legal process, and that kind of delay was very bad for his business operations. He needed liquidity, and he needed it fast. Then he made his offer. He said he would personally cover the entire $212,000 that Logan had stolen, plus an additional $50,000 for my pain and suffering, if I would agree to drop all charges and sign a settlement agreement stating this was a civil matter that had been resolved privately. In exchange, he wanted me to make a statement to the prosecutors that I no longer wished to pursue criminal charges, and that I believed Logan had made a terrible mistake but didn't deserve to have his life ruined over it. I sat there in stunned silence, processing what he'd just said. Victor Ashford was offering me more than $250,000 to let Logan walk away. It was more money than I'd ever had in my personal account at one time. It would pay off my student loans, my car, and leave me with a substantial nest egg. But something about this felt wrong. I asked Victor why he cared so much about Logan getting off when he could just as easily wait for the investigation to conclude and get his money back through insurance. Victor's smile faded slightly, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a lower register. He told me that insurance claims took time and attracted attention, and attention was something he preferred to avoid in his line of business. He said that if federal investigators started digging too deeply into his accounts, they might find other transactions that were perfectly legal but difficult to explain, and he didn't want to deal with that headache. Then, Jonathan Pierce, the attorney, chimed in with a reminder that this offer was time-sensitive and would expire in 24 hours. They were applying pressure, making it clear that this was a take-it-or-leave-it situation. I told them I needed time to think about it, but Victor cut me off. He said there was no time because the preliminary hearing was scheduled for next week, and once Logan was formally indicted, the offer would be off the table permanently. He pushed a folder across the table toward me and told me everything I needed was in there, including the settlement agreement and a cashier's check already made out in my name for $262,000. All I had to do was sign. I opened the folder and stared at that check. The numbers seemed almost unreal. This was enough money to change my life. But as I sat there looking at it, I thought about Logan's face when they put him in handcuffs. I thought about all the years he'd treated me like garbage, and I thought about my mother who had enabled his behavior every step of the way. If I took this money, Logan would learn nothing. He'd walk away thinking that money could solve any problem, that there were no real consequences for his actions as long as someone was willing to pay. And my mother would continue to baby him, convincing herself that I'd forgiven him when in reality I'd just been bought off. I closed the folder and slid it back across the table. I told Victor thank you for the generous offer, but I couldn't accept it. Victor's expression hardened, and he asked me if I understood what I was turning down. I told him I understood perfectly, but some things were more important than money. Jonathan Pierce tried to jump in with some legal talk about how this decision could expose me to countersuits and complications, but I stood up from the table and told them both that my decision was final. As I walked out of that restaurant, my hands were shaking, but I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. I felt powerful. I felt like for the first time in this entire mess, I was the one in control. But the next morning, everything changed again. I woke up to 17 missed calls on my phone and a voicemail from Detective Chin asking me to call him immediately. When I called back, his voice was tense. He told me that overnight, someone had posted Logan's bail at $500,000 cash, and Logan had been released from custody. The bail had been posted anonymously through a legal service, which meant we had no idea who had paid it. My first thought was Victor Ashford, but Chin said they'd already checked, and it wasn't him. Whoever posted bail had gone through extensive measures to hide their identity. This meant Logan was out on the street, and I had no idea what he might do next. I immediately called Michael to ask if he knew anything about the bail, but he sounded just as confused as I was. He told me he and my mother certainly didn't have that kind of money, and Logan didn't have any friends wealthy enough to post bail like that. Something very strange was happening, and I didn't like it one bit. That afternoon, I came home from work to find Logan sitting on my front porch. He was wearing an ankle monitor and looked like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw me, he stood up, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw something genuine in his expression. It wasn't arrogance or entitlement. It was fear mixed with something that almost looked like regret. He told me he needed to talk to me and that it was important. Every instinct told me to walk past him and go inside, but something made me stop. I asked him what he wanted, and his next words shocked me more than anything else that had happened. He said that he knew who posted his bail and that I was in serious danger. He told me I needed to drop the charges immediately because the people who got him out weren't doing it to help him. They were doing it to protect themselves, and if I kept pushing this case forward, they would come after me next. I felt a chill run down my spine as Logan explained what he'd learned while in custody. Apparently, the dealership where he'd bought the BMW wasn't just a regular car dealer. It was allegedly being used as a front for a money laundering operation tied to a larger criminal organization that moved cash through high-value vehicle sales. When Logan made that massive purchase using my card, he'd accidentally flagged one of their transactions. And now, federal investigators were looking into the dealership's entire operation. The people running this operation knew that if Logan went to trial, the prosecution would subpoena all the dealership's records, and that would expose everything. So they'd posted his bail, hoping he would disappear, or that I would drop the charges to make the whole thing go away. Logan told me he'd received a visit in jail from someone who made it very clear that cooperating with federal investigators would be bad for his health, and by extension, bad for my health too. I stood there processing this information, trying to figure out if Logan was telling the truth, or if this was some elaborate manipulation to get me to back off. I asked him how I was supposed to believe anything he said after what he'd done, and Logan's face crumpled. He told me he knew he'd messed up worse than he'd ever messed up before, and that he was genuinely sorry for stealing from me. He said he'd been selfish and stupid and arrogant, and he deserved everything that was happening to him, but he didn't want me to get hurt because of his mistakes. For the first time in the 6 years I'd known Logan, he actually sounded sincere. But sincerity didn't change the facts. If what he was saying was true, then I wasn't just dealing with a spoiled stepbrother anymore. I was potentially caught in the middle of a federal investigation into organized crime, and the wrong move could put me in real physical danger. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed replaying everything that had happened, trying to connect all the pieces. Victor Ashford's suspicious eagerness to settle, the anonymous bail payment, Logan's warning about the dealership. Something much bigger was happening here, and I was right in the center of it. The next morning, I received another call from Detective Chin, and this time his tone was completely different. He told me that I needed to come to the federal building immediately for my own safety. When I arrived, I was escorted into a conference room where Chen was waiting along with Agent Winters and two other people I didn't recognize. One was introduced as Special Agent Rodriguez from the FBI's Organized Crime Division, and the other was Assistant U.S. Attorney Catherine Morrison. They told me to sit down because what they were about to tell me would change everything I thought I knew about this case. Catherine Morrison didn't waste any time with pleasantries. She opened a laptop and turned it toward me, showing me a complex flowchart that looked like something out of a crime thriller. She explained that for the past 18 months, a federal task force had been investigating a sophisticated money laundering network operating throughout the Midwest, and the BMW dealership where Logan made his purchase was a key node in that network. They'd been building their case slowly, gathering evidence, but they needed something to give them legal justification to raid the dealership and seize all. Their records. Logan's fraudulent purchase had given them exactly that. When he used my card to buy that car, he'd created a paper trail that connected my investment account to the dealership, and because my account was used for legitimate business purposes, any suspicious activity associated with it automatically triggered enhanced scrutiny under federal banking regulations. In other words, Logan had accidentally given federal investigators the legal opening they'd been waiting for. Special Agent Rodriguez pulled up another screen showing surveillance photos of various people entering and leaving the dealership. He pointed to one man in particular, a heavy-set guy with a gray beard wearing an expensive suit. Rodriguez told me that was Dmitry Volkov, a Russian national with suspected ties to organized crime who had been operating in the United States for almost a decade. Volkov ran a network that moved money from illegal sources through seemingly legitimate businesses, and the car dealership was just one of many fronts he controlled. They believed Volkov's organization was responsible for posting Logan's bail because they wanted to control the narrative and potentially intimidate witnesses. Rodriguez said that Volkov's organization didn't just move money, they also gathered information, and they had likely been monitoring me since the moment Logan's arrest became public. That meant they knew where I lived, where I worked, and probably everything about my daily routine. Agent Winters leaned forward and told me very directly that I was now considered a material witness in a federal racketeering investigation, and that meant I was under their protection whether I liked it or not. She said they wanted me to continue pressing charges against Logan because his case was the thread they needed to pull to unravel Volkov's entire operation. If Logan went to trial, they could subpoena the dealership's records, and once they had those records, they could trace the money back through multiple shell companies and eventually bring down the whole network. But they needed me to be willing to testify, and they needed me to understand that doing so would put me at risk. Catherine Morrison added that they could offer me witness protection if necessary, but they hoped it wouldn't come to that. They just needed me to stay strong and see this through. I sat there feeling completely overwhelmed. This had started as a simple case of credit card fraud, and now I was apparently a key witness in a federal organized crime investigation. I asked them what would happen to Logan, and Morrison's expression softened slightly. She told me that Logan was a small fish in a very big pond, and while he'd committed serious crimes, the prosecutors were primarily interested in the people above him. If Logan cooperated fully with the investigation and testified about everything he knew regarding the dealership's operations, they would be willing to offer him a plea deal that would significantly reduce his sentence. He might end up with probation and restitution instead of prison time. But that deal was only on the table if I agreed to move forward with the case. Rodriguez told me that Volkov's people moved fast, and if they decided I was a threat, they wouldn't hesitate to take action. He said I needed to make a decision right now, in this room, about whether I was willing to see this through. The room fell silent as everyone stared at me, waiting for my answer. My mind was racing through all the possible outcomes. If I said yes, I'd be putting myself in danger, but potentially bringing down a criminal organization and getting justice not just for myself, but for countless other victims. If I said no, I'd be safe, but Logan would learn nothing, and dangerous criminals would continue operating freely. And then I remembered something my father used to tell me before he died. He used to say that doing the right thing was rarely the easy thing, and that the measure of a person's character wasn't what they did when everything was fine, but what they did when everything was falling apart. I took a deep breath and told them I was in. I would press charges, I would testify, and I would do whatever they needed me to do to help bring these people down. Catherine Morrison smiled and told me I'd made the right choice. Agent Winters said they would arrange for increased security around my home and workplace, and that I should avoid any unnecessary travel or contact with people I didn't know well. They gave me an emergency number to call if anything suspicious happened, and then they let me leave. As I walked out of that federal building, I felt like I was stepping into a completely different life than the one I'd woken up to that morning. Over the next few weeks, things moved incredibly fast. The federal task force executed search warrants at the dealership and 3 other businesses connected to Volkov's network. They seized computers, financial records, and several luxury vehicles, including the BMW M8 that Logan had bought with my card. The local news covered the raids extensively, and suddenly my case wasn't just about a stolen credit card anymore. It was front-page news. My firm's partners called me in again, and this time, instead of being concerned, they were supportive. They told me they admired my courage and that the firm would stand behind me throughout the legal process. Logan took the plea deal. He agreed to testify against the dealership's owners and provide detailed information about how the transaction had been processed. In exchange, he pled guilty to 1 count of credit card fraud and was sentenced to 3 years probation, 500 hours of community service, and full restitution of the money he'd stolen, which would be paid back through a court-ordered payment plan over the next 10 years. It wasn't prison, but it wasn't nothing either. He would have a felony record that would follow him for the rest of his life, and he'd be making monthly payments to me for a decade. My mother was devastated by the outcome, but even she couldn't argue that Logan had gotten off relatively easy. The real drama came during Volkov's trial 6 months later. I was called to testify about the initial fraud and how it had led investigators to examine the dealership's records. I was terrified walking into that courtroom knowing that Volkov and his associates were sitting just a few feet away, watching my every move. But Catherine Morrison had prepared me well, and I answered every question clearly and confidently. My testimony helped establish the chain of events that had exposed Volkov's operation, and when combined with the mountain of financial evidence the task force had gathered, it was enough to convict him and 4 other members of his organization on multiple counts of money laundering, racketeering, and fraud. Volkov was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. His associates got similar sentences. The dealership was permanently shut down. But here's where the story takes another unexpected turn. Remember that investment account linked to my stolen credit card? During the investigation, federal auditors had examined every transaction in that account going back 5 years, and they'd found something interesting. One of my other clients, a man named Richard Chen, who ran an import-export business, had been making regular deposits that didn't match his reported income. When investigators dug deeper, they discovered that Chen had been using my investment services to launder money from an illegal gambling operation. He'd been doing it so carefully that I'd never noticed, hiding the dirty money among legitimate business transactions. That was the scariest part of this entire ordeal because I genuinely had no idea what Chen had been doing. I'd managed his account according to standard procedures, never suspecting anything illegal. Catherine Morrison believed me, but she said I needed to cooperate fully with the investigation into Chen's activities. I turned over every document I had, every email, every phone record. Eventually, the investigators concluded that I had been an unwitting accomplice and that Chen had deliberately chosen me as his account manager because I was young and inexperienced enough that I wouldn't notice his scheme. Chen was arrested and charged with money laundering, and my name was cleared. In the end, the federal government seized all of Chen's assets, including the money he'd deposited in my managed account. But here's the miracle part that nobody saw coming. Because I'd been a victim of Chen's scheme and because my cooperation had been instrumental in bringing down not just Chen, but also Volkov's network, the U.S. Attorney's Office filed a motion to have me compensated from the seized assets. The judge agreed, and I was awarded $475,000 from the forfeiture fund. That was more than twice what Logan had stolen from me, and it came at a time when I desperately needed it because my legal fees had been substantial. The money was life-changing. I paid off all my debts, put a down payment on my own condo away from my mother and stepfather, and invested the rest properly. Logan and I eventually reached an understanding. He completed his community service working at a nonprofit that helped at-risk youth, and the experience actually changed him. He apologized again, and this time I believed him because I could see the difference in how he carried himself. He wasn't the cocky, entitled kid anymore. He was someone who'd faced real consequences and learned from them. We're not close, and we probably never will be, but we can be in the same room now without tension, and that's real progress. The final chapter of this story happened almost exactly 1 year after Logan first pulled that BMW into our driveway. I was sitting in my new condo when I received a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice. My hands trembled as I opened it, but this letter wasn't bad news. It was an official commendation from the Attorney General's office recognizing my cooperation in the investigation that had led to the dismantling of Volkov's money laundering network. The letter explained that my willingness to press charges and testify had been instrumental in bringing down an organization that had laundered an estimated $300 million over the past decade. But the letter didn't stop there. It went on to say that due to the exceptional nature of my contribution and the financial hardship I'd experienced, I was being awarded an additional compensation payment from the Federal Asset Forfeiture Fund. The amount was $225,000. I literally screamed when I read that number. Between this payment and the previous award, I had received $700,000 in total compensation. The money Logan had stolen had somehow transformed into the best financial outcome of my entire life. It was the kind of miracle you couldn't make up if you tried. That evening, I called my Aunt Marie, who had always been my biggest supporter. I told her everything that had happened, and she laughed so hard she cried. She told me my father would have been so proud of how I'd handled everything, standing up for what was right, even when it was scary and difficult. Talking to her made me realize that this whole nightmare had actually been a blessing in disguise. It had forced me to find strength I didn't know I had, and it had given me financial security beyond anything I could have achieved just by working and saving carefully. The relationship with my mother remained complicated. She never fully forgave me for pressing charges against Logan, even though Logan himself had come to understand why I'd done it. We settled into a distant but civil relationship. We saw each other on holidays, but the closeness we'd once had was gone. It hurt, but I'd made peace with it, sometimes standing. Up for yourself means losing people who can't accept that you have boundaries. Michael, my stepfather, surprised me by being incredibly supportive once he understood the full scope of what had happened. He apologized for initially trying to get me to drop the charges and told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything. As for Logan, the probation and community service genuinely transformed him. About 8 months into his sentence, he called me and asked if we could meet for coffee. When we met, he looked different. He told me he'd been working with kids from broken homes who'd gotten involved in petty crime, and hearing their stories had made him realize how easily he could have ended up in a much worse situation. He said he understood now why I'd done what I did, and that he didn't blame me. Then, he told me something that shocked me. He said he'd started taking online classes in business management and was planning to get a degree so he could work with at-risk youth full-time. He wanted to turn his mistake into something meaningful. I told him I was proud of him, and I meant it. He thanked me with tears in his eyes and said none of this growth would have happened if I'd let him off easy. A few months later, I got news that Victor Ashford, the real estate developer who'd tried to bribe me, had been indicted on separate charges related to tax evasion and fraud. He ended up pleading guilty and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd tried to pay me off to avoid scrutiny, but his attempt to interfere had actually drawn more attention to his own criminal activities. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways. With my newfound financial security, I made big life changes. I left my job and started my own independent financial advisory practice, focusing on helping young professionals manage their money ethically. My reputation from the case actually helped my business grow because people trusted my integrity. Within 6 months, I had more clients than I could handle. Within a year, I was making more money than I'd ever made at the firm, doing it on my own terms. I also started volunteering with a nonprofit that helped crime victims navigate the legal system. I shared my story at support group meetings and helped people understand their rights. It was incredibly fulfilling work. The final miracle came about 3 months ago. I received a call from Catherine Morrison telling me that the Department of Justice was creating a new program to train financial professionals on how to spot money laundering and other financial crimes. And they wanted me to be one of the lead instructors. The job would involve traveling to different cities, teaching workshops, and helping professionals understand red flags in client relationships. The pay was excellent, and more importantly, it would allow me to turn my horrible experience into something that could prevent other people from being victimized. I accepted immediately. So, here I am now, living in a beautiful condo that I own outright, running a successful financial advisory practice, volunteering with crime victims, and about to start training other professionals to fight financial crime. My relationship with Logan has evolved into something resembling mutual respect, and I have $700,000 in investments that grew from a $200,000 theft. The lesson I learned is simple but powerful. When someone wrongs you, you have two choices. You can take the easy path and let them off the hook because it's more comfortable. Or you can take the hard path, hold them accountable even when it's scary, and trust that justice will prevail. The easy path doesn't lead to growth. The hard path is uncomfortable and sometimes painful, but it's the only path that leads to real change and real justice. Logan stole my credit card thinking he'd gotten away with the crime of the century. Instead, he accidentally triggered a chain of events that brought down a massive criminal organization, transformed his own life, and gave me financial security beyond my wildest dreams. That $200,000 car ended up costing him his freedom and 10 years of payments, but it also gave him the wake-up call he needed to become a better person, and it gave me the strength and resources to build a life I'm truly proud of. Justice was served, but not in the straightforward way anyone predicted. Sometimes the universe has a plan that's better than anything you could imagine, but you have to be willing to do the right thing even when you can't see how it will work out. That commitment to justice over convenience is what separates people who let life happen to them from people who take control of their own story. And now, finally, I can say with absolute certainty that I took control of mine.